October 7th, 1942. 2:11 hours. The Gołąbki rail junction on the western outskirts of Warsaw lay quiet beneath a thin layer of frost, the kind that dulls metal until it looks powdered with chalk. The long line of freight cars parked along the siding had stopped breathing minutes earlier, their brakes no longer hissing, just ticking slowly as iron cooled in the night air. From a distance, the tracks stretched straight and black, like hardened seams in the soil. Up close, they were slick with ice. Sergeant Antoni Kwiatkowski knelt beside the western track with a canvas satchel resting against his leg. He wore no uniform except a civilian coat with grease-dark cuffs, boots lined with burlap, and wool gloves with the fingertips cut away. The night air smelled faintly of tar and coal smoke from distant boilers. But closer to him, it smelled only of cold iron and the sour sting of fertilizer dust. He pulled a wrapped object from the satchel and placed it gently against the base of the rail. He had exactly 9 minutes before the patrol car returned. He did not look at a wristwatch. He did not own one. Instead, his timing came from another device lying open in the snow beside him. The interior of a broken alarm clock. Its metal cover had been removed, its gears exposed like tiny brass bones, its spring rewound by hand. A mechanical spark would ignite the fuse when the short hand reached a scratched line in its casing. The clock ticked faintly, a weak but steady pulse, the only sound competing with the breath leaving his nose in pale white streams. He pressed the charge into place. It did not look like a bomb. It looked like a paper-wrapped wedge of food from a butcher's counter, the kind tied with twine. But there was no butcher paper inside. There was only agricultural nitrate mixed with fuel, shaped into a double-wedged cone. He had molded it using a tin bread pan pressed against an iron wedge cut from a damaged farm plow. The edges had been sharpened with a file until they could bite steel instead of turn aside from it. The purpose was not to explode upward. It was to force the rail to snap along its interior grain, the same way split wood follows its line beneath an axe. A deviation of 4 degrees would ruin it. He measured the angle again using a piece of wire shaped into an improvised square. His hands were steady despite the cold, and the tips of his fingers, exposed through the torn gloves, were red but still sensitive. He adjusted one of the cast iron wedges by no more than the thickness of a fingernail. Too far upright, and the force would disperse into the ballast stones. Too low, and it would shear the bolts without twisting the web. The goal was distortion, not removal. A distorted track could not be fixed quickly. A missing piece could be replaced. Metal bent the right way, however, required cranes, teams, and hours. He reached into the satchel once more and removed 2 telegraph insulators, thick glass pieces, scavenged from discarded poles. He wedged them between the charge and the rail base to clamp the device tight. The insulators were not there to strengthen the explosion. They were there to ensure every fragment of force was pushed inward, not outward. He smeared tar against the joint to seal the paper and glass together, then held it in place for several seconds to let the cold bind it stiff. A short crackle came through the pocket radio buried beneath his coat. The voice was hushed, barely above a whisper, its Polish clipped by nerves. 5 minutes. Kwiatkowski did not respond. The lookout did not expect him to. He gave the insulators one final push, locked them tighter with a scrap of wire, then brushed the snow away from the clock. The device ticked on, slow and precise. He attached the fuse to the spark mechanism, stripped the end with his teeth, and checked the connection by touch. The sparker would fire against a rag soaked in alcohol and ignition compound. If moisture had seeped into it, the fuse would burn too slowly or fail. If it failed, the Germans would find the device and begin searching farms for suspects before dawn. He paused only long enough to check his work, not to consider the consequence. There was no emotion to weigh. Either the charge sheared the track or the patrol did. Either result was final. He took one last look at the rail. The charge lay folded against the base, tight and angled. The fuse line ran beneath the sleepers and into the brush, just long enough to let him slip away before detonation. The broken clock ticked faintly in the snow, its hands moving along their scratched arc toward the moment when sparks would leap into the line. Kwiatkowski lifted his satchel, brushed frost from his knees, and rose. He checked no watch, no chart. His timing was set. He backed away from the track, boots crunching softly, then stepped into the undergrowth where pine boughs swallowed him whole. The fuse wire trailed behind him like a thin root disappearing into soil. He moved quickly, not running but never pausing, every stride measured by the distance of the fuse's length and the rhythm of the ticking machine. The rail remained still behind him, glistening faintly under frost, silent beneath cold starlight. The freight cars did not move. The metal wheels did not breathe. Only the tiny clock continued counting, gear by gear, second by second, toward an impact not meant to destroy, but to bend. Not to blast apart, but to deform. Not to announce itself, but to deny passage. Kwiatkowski reached the line of trees, disappeared beneath the branches, and crouched low among the roots. The ticking continued. The fuse waited. The track held its breath. 3 months earlier, late July 1942. The town of Minsk Mazowiecki lay under cloudless summer heat. Brittle and dry, the air heavy with coal dust from the railway workshops. German freight cars clattered constantly through the depot, some carrying troops, some carrying crates stamped with black eagles, all guarded by sentries with machine pistols slung across their shoulders. The station platform smelled of axle grease, boiled cabbage from a nearby canteen, and ammonia from fertilizer shipments stacked in battered wooden crates. Sergeant Antoni Kwiatkowski stood beside a Polish Home Army courier and stared at twisted metal lying at his feet. It was not mangled enough. That was the problem. The wreckage came from a failed sabotage attempt conducted 2 nights earlier by a partisan group operating 30 kilometers south. The explosion had blackened the sleepers and dented the steel web of the rail, but it had not severed it. German repair crews had straightened the dent with hydraulic jacks and relayed the line before sunrise. The track had been reopened in less than 6 hours. The sabotage was symbolic, not strategic. It wasted men, explosives, and risked informants without altering the war. Kwiatkowski crouched to inspect the torn bolts. He touched the steel like a craftsman, evaluating flaws in a beam. The explosion had been strong, the chemical mix correct. But the damage spread outward instead of inward, dispersing force along ballast rock and soil. The metal resisted the blast because it had strength in width, not vulnerability at its edges. Rail was hardened to bear weight, not to withstand fractures that struck at the correct seam. Next to the dented section lay the failed detonator, a crushed firing cap attached to a simple fuse. Moisture from dew had slowed the burn. The blast occurred 2 seconds late, after the saboteur had already retreated. The Germans had heard the sound, mobilized, and patrolled farmhouses by noon the next day. 2 men were arrested. 1 did not survive the interrogation. A Polish courier handed Kwiatkowski a folded sheet of thin paper, the kind used to wrap bread in poor bakeries. Inside were scribbled notes from the sabotage team. They had used 2 kilograms of industrial explosives stolen from a quarry. The charge had been planted directly beneath the rail and ignited from 8 meters away. The mixture had burned correctly, but the rail endured. Kwiatkowski studied the notes and diagrams silently. He did not disagree with the men who had tried. They followed the only method they knew: direct upward force. They had tried to break steel by smashing it. But force alone was careless. It ignored geometry. It ignored material behavior. Rail did not fail by strength. It failed by leverage. Strike the metal at its web, angle pressure along its grain, and even hardened steel would twist. He ran a fingertip along the underside of the rail, stopping where the steel narrowed into a thin web beneath the head. He pressed lightly with his thumb. The shape reminded him of wood grain running through chopped logs in the villages south of Krakow. If an axe fell flat against a log, it bounced. But angled into the grain, even a weak swing split wood like paper. He stood, wiped his sound fingers on his coat, and said nothing. He was not a commander. No one expected a speech. The courier waited for instruction. Instead, Kwiatkowski asked one question. How long until the next shipment passes? The courier checked notes. 1,700 hours tonight. Ammunition, 2 flat cars, 4 box cars, then a gap. A gap meant opportunity. A gap meant time to work. But Kwiatkowski did not ask to carry explosives. He requested something else. I need plow wedges, he said. Broken ones, rusted. As many as you can find. The courier frowned, confused. Wedges? For farming? Yes. No explosives? Explosives later. First wedges. The courier shrugged. How many? As many as there are fields, he answered. That afternoon, Kwiatkowski walked to a nearby farm. He traded 2 hours of labor for a pile of discarded iron shapes lying behind a barn. They were worn plow tips, broken blades, twisted teeth from tilling machines. Farmers kept such things for scrap dealers who rarely arrived. To them, they were useless metal. To him, they were precision tools. He carried the pile back wrapped in burlap, each piece singing softly as they clanged together. He did not build a bomb that night. He spent the time filing edges, sharpening, measuring angles. Explosives were not the invention. Geometry was. August 1942. A rented attic room above a bakery on Ogrodowa Street smelled of yeast, ash, and petroleum. The windows were shuttered with cardboard and flour sacks to block light at night. On a table meant for kneading dough lay objects no baker would ever use. Iron wedges, glass insulators, roofing tar in a rusted can, and a stack of brown butcher paper. Beside them sat bowls of fertilizer grains, charcoal powder, and kerosene, sealed in tiny jars that once held preserves. Sergeant Antoni Kwiatkowski had no laboratory. His test bench was a kitchen floor. His ventilation was a cracked chimney pipe. He wore no protective equipment except a rag tied around his mouth. Yet his movements were precise, like a watchmaker handling brass gears. His platoon called him chemic, but even they did not realize he treated bomb design as engineering, rather than destruction. He spent 3 evenings studying fertilizer mixtures before striking a single spark. The nitrate content of agricultural stock varied by humidity. Moist sacks stored in barns absorbed water from damp soil. Dry sacks taken from rail depots held a higher concentration. Moist grains produced slow burns and incomplete detonation. Dry grains produced rapid, hotter blasts. A charge that burned too quickly would scatter force outward like an open hand. A charge that burned with a delay would push inward like a clenched fist. He wrote measurements in pencil on bread wrappers, calculating ratios as though he were constructing a bridge beam. 3 parts nitrate, 1 part soot, a fraction of kerosene. Too much fuel meant smoke and no pressure. Too little meant no binding. Meanwhile, he shaped the wedges. Rail was tempered steel. Explosive force alone could not break it efficiently. But wedge-shaped iron, pressed by force, could shear metal the same way scissors cut wire. He tested wedge angles by pushing them against scrap rails scavenged from a junkyard. He tapped each wedge with a hammer to see whether it bit or skidded. Those that skidded, he filed down. Those that bit, he sharpened carefully until their edges gleamed faintly. He burned his fingers more than once, but he did not curse. He simply noted where tar dripped wrong, where paper warped, where fuel seeped. Failure was data. Silence was concentration. On the fifth night, a courier brought a request from a nearby district. They wanted explosives for bridge demolition. Standard charges, nothing unusual. Kwiatkowski refused. Give them quarry charge, not mine. The courier blinked. Your charges are stronger? No, mine are specific. Specific how? They are not for bridges, they are for rails. Only rails? The courier frowned. A bomb is a bomb. No, Kwiatkowski answered. A hammer is not a saw. He returned to work. By the seventh night, he had produced his first shaped charge, a small wedge wrapped in waxed cloth, sealed with tar, and mounted on a broken hinge to hold shape. It was meant for testing on a riverbank, not for combat. 2 men carried it to an abandoned siding outside Żyrardów. They dug into the ballast, placed the charge, and lit it from a safe distance. Kwiatkowski observed from behind brush, watching the angle of blast, the plume of displaced gravel. The result disappointed him. The explosion pushed the rail upward, but did not shear the underside. The wedge slipped slightly before detonation. The failure lay not in the mix, but in the clamp. He stooped and lifted a shard of glass from the ground. Telegraph insulator. Thick, heavy, heat-resistant. Ideas clicked together again. Iron wedges needed rigid bracing. Glass could act as clamp, forcing pressure inward instead of dispersing outward. The second test, 4 nights later, used 2 glass insulators as braces. The blast sheared the underside of the rail web, twisting it until the line could no longer fit in its clips. Repair teams would need cranes. They would need hours. It was no longer sabotage for symbolism. It was now sabotage that stole time. Time was war's most valuable resource. He returned to the attic, wrote new ratios, calculated fuse burn times, measured clock gears with a caliper made from bent wire. He needed a delay mechanism that did not rely on humidity or faulty matches. The answer came from the bakery downstairs, a broken alarm clock recovered from a junk drawer. Its bell was missing. Its knob was worn smooth. But the spring worked. If rewound by hand and adjusted, it could spin a gear that produced sparks against a strip of flint. 2 hours of filing, 1 hour of testing. The spark caught flame on a scrap fuse. He trimmed the timing again and again until he could predict ignition within a few heartbeats. The device was ugly. Wrapped in paper, sealed by tar, braced with glass. A bomb made from farm tools, kitchen waste, and broken clocks. But it was no longer theory. It could shear steel with almost surgical precision. It was ready to leave the attic. When his platoon commander asked how powerful it was, Kwiatkowski answered without hesitation. It does not need power. It needs direction. Late September 1942. The village of Wielka Węglowa sat between thin pine groves and potato fields, half a kilometer from a minor freight spur used to shuttle fuel toward Warsaw. It was not a major line, not part of any strategic German report. But that was precisely why the Polish Home Army chose it. Sabotage on important lines brought heavy reprisals. Sabotage on quiet ones went unnoticed until it cost time. Time mattered more than noise. Sergeant Antoni Kwiatkowski arrived at dusk, carrying a wrapped loaf of bread under his arm. Inside the loaf, hollowed out meticulously, rested another clock mechanism, fuse coil, and a wedge charge. The bakery woman who sold it to him knew nothing. She only joked that he bought more bread than he ate. He paid with a ration coupon and left without speaking. 2 men from his platoon, Staszek and Karol, waited in a ditch near the tracks. They were fighters, not engineers. They carried pistols, grenades, and the nervous anticipation of men who expected movement in the dark. They knew how to kill, how to run, how to burn documents. They did not understand how to bend steel. Karol glanced at the loaf. "You bring supper or trouble?" Kwiatkowski answered simply, "Both," and began cutting the bread open with a pocket knife. They watched with mild disbelief as he removed the charge, unwrapped waxed paper, and checked the clock. His calmness irritated Karol, whose hands trembled from nerves. It was not that Kwiatkowski feared nothing. He feared mistakes more than bullets. Bullets ended a life. Mistakes ended operations. The line lay quiet beneath the pale moon, rails gleaming faintly with dew. Every few minutes they heard a distant engine, but none approached the spur. The Germans did not guard this section with patrol cars. They believed sabotage would focus on central arteries. They underestimated the value of minor delays. Staszek kept watch through binoculars scavenged from a downed Soviet pilot a year earlier. The lenses were chipped, but good enough to catch motion. He whispered, "No movement. 1 signal tower, 1 house by the switch." "Good," Kwiatkowski replied. "We are not here for guards. We are here for alignment." They moved quickly to the rail. Staszek and Karol stood guard with pistols drawn as Kwiatkowski knelt again. He scraped frost from the base, brushed debris from the bolts, and tested the metal with his knuckles. Cold made steel brittle. That worked in his favor. He positioned 2 wedges beneath the rail web, then braced them with a single glass insulator. The soil here was softer than at the Gołąbki junction. The blast might bleed downward unless the bracing held. He pressed the charge harder, packing gravel beneath the insulator with his thumb. Staszek muttered, "Feels too quiet." "Quiet is loud," Karol replied. They were right. Silence amplified tension. Kwiatkowski set the clock mechanism, wound the spring 1 rotation, then half a turn more. The spark timing here needed to be shorter. Patrols did not matter, but passing engines did. A freight train could arrive early. It happened often. Timetables were suggestions, not rules. The spark would ignite in 4 minutes and perhaps 20 seconds. He whispered, "Get into cover. Not far. We must see the angle." Karol almost protested. "Watch the blast? Why?" "Because if the angle is wrong, we learn nothing." Karol exhaled sharply. "Or we die learning." "Better to die learning than live ignorant," Kwiatkowski said. It was not bravado. It was mathematics. If dozens died later because a wedge angle failed, better 1 or 2 die tonight. War rewarded precision more than courage. They moved to a ditch beneath low shrubs. From there they could see the track clearly. Staszek checked his pistol again. Karol stared at the clock device, its gears faintly visible. Kwiatkowski watched the fuse line twitch in the breeze. The spark came early, perhaps 15 seconds sooner than calculation. A flash inside the bread wrapper, then ignition. The fuse burned fast, spitting sparks into the ballast. Karol flinched. Staszek held his breath. Kwiatkowski counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The blast struck downward, then inward, like a blacksmith's hammer hitting a chisel. Gravel sprayed upward, but did not scatter far. There was no booming echo. just a contained crack like a tree splitting under frost. A shock wave rippled through the sleepers. The rail base shuddered. When smoke cleared, they rose cautiously. The railhead remained intact, but the web beneath it had twisted like wrung cloth. The bolts connecting it to the plate were sheared. The alignment was warped by perhaps 2 centimeters. It did not sound dramatic. It did not look like destruction. But no wheel traveling at speed would stay upon it. A train hitting that deformity would derail. Carol exhaled. All that, and it barely looks damaged. Kwiatkowski smiled faintly. That is the point. Stasek touched the bent web. How long to fix? With jacks and men, 1 hour. With cranes, several. If they call technicians, half a day. If they need parts, a day and a night. Carol stared at the twist. And this was a loaf of bread? Kwiatkowski shook his head. This was direction. They retreated without running, without exultation. They left the track looking deceptively ordinary. In the morning, a German freight train carrying fuel drums rolled across the bend at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. The derailment twisted metal, toppled 2 cars into the ditch, and blocked the spur with debris. German engineers arrived by midday. They used jacks. They failed. They sent for cranes. They came late. They requested new bolts. They did not arrive until the next sunrise. A minor line became unusable for 32 hours. No explosions killed soldiers. No firefight occurred. No partisan died. But time was stolen. And in war, time shapes every death that follows. October 7th, 1942. The same night, Kwiatkowski knelt at Gołąbki, 40 kilometers south of Warsaw. Officers of the German 17th Infantry Corps sat around a coal-fired stove inside a requisition school building in Radom. Major Heinrich Kruger studied supply manifests stacked like bricks on his desk. He traced a gloved finger down the column listing munitions, food ration tins, livestock feed, winter coat consignments, and aviation fuel marked high priority. The Corps required 1,200 tons of supplies every day to remain operational. That was not theory. That was arithmetic. Horses ate. Troops froze. Artillery needed shells. Stukas needed fuel. Outside, a thin rain began to fall, mixing with soot from nearby factories. Staff officers believed the rail system that fed Radom was secure. Sabotage occurred further east, closer to Lublin, and further north near Białystok. Warsaw's western junctions, they assumed, were too close to central command posts to be vulnerable. They were wrong. At 03:22 hours, an outbound German supply train carrying spare carburetor parts for trucks, rifle ammunition, and coal briquettes reached the Gołąbki junction. It rode across the angled distortion left by Kwiatkowski's charge. The engineer felt a jolt beneath the wheels, but did not recognize the danger until one axle cracked against the twisted rail web. The locomotive lurched. 2 freight cars tipped. The weight of coal dragged the engine sideways, and a grinding shriek echoed through the night. No one died. The train simply folded into itself like a poorly stacked deck. To soldiers on guard nearby, it looked like a routine derailment. Accidents happened. Track maintenance was a constant burden. They sent runners to fetch engineers. They radioed division headquarters. No panic, no alarm. But the junction mattered. 4 supply lines met at Gołąbki, feeding the corridor between Warsaw and Radom. One derailment blocked the line. Engineers arriving at dawn attempted repairs, just as they had learned to do with previous sabotage. They brought hydraulic jacks, iron levers, and temporary cross ties. They tried to straighten the steel. The wedges had not blown the rail apart. They had bent it inward. twisting it against its mounting plates. The more the Germans tried to push it straight, the more the bolts snapped. By 1000 hours, the line was still unusable. A dispatcher from Radom radioed furiously. Urgent ammunition shipment delayed. Train full of winter boots and feed stood waiting near Piastov. Another hauling artillery shells waited further up the line. Bottleneck pressure increased by the hour. The Corps' logistics timing assumed continuous flow. Halted trains backed into each other. Sidings filled. By noon, 7 trains across 80 kilometers were stalled. Major Kruger slammed his fist onto his desk. Why are they not moving? His aide, Oberleutnant Weber, hesitated before answering. Repairs require larger machinery, Herr Major. The rail is not merely bent. It is contorted. Kruger pressed harder. Then use cranes. Use jackhammers. Use a workshop. Move it! We have requested cranes, Weber said. They are en route from Lodz. They will arrive tonight. Kruger froze. Tonight meant 14 hours without rail movement. Fuel depots ran on strict quotas. Horses would be unfed by evening. Ammunition stocks fell short by morning. The weather was turning. Wet soldiers needed coats. A corps in motion starved. A corps in winter froze. While German officers grappled with transportation losses on their maps, the men responsible for the damage melted back into hiding. Kwiatkowski spent the morning not celebrating, but sleeping briefly in a barn loft above sacks of onions. He rose at noon and walked into town to purchase nails and twine. His platoon commander met him and whispered, "The junction is closed. The Germans cannot fix it." Kwiatkowski only frowned. They will, eventually. You should be proud. No. Proud means finished. We are not finished. The commander nodded, uncertain whether he was speaking to a saboteur or a mathematician. They parted with no further words. At 1600 hours, a report reached German headquarters in Warsaw. It was terse. Rail junction inoperable. Cause unclear. Engineers suspected freezing stress or metal fatigue due to heavy freight. Sabotage was not dismissed, but they could not understand how explosives produce such damage without leaving obvious crater pits or scorch patterns. The charge had not blasted the track. It had sheared it. The signature did not match known Polish methods. The line finally reopened 48 hours and 19 minutes after the derailment. Cranes arrived late due to conflicting priorities. Fresh bolts were requisitioned from Łódź. Replacement rails had to be dragged down muddy track by manual labor because motorized trucks were overloaded with other duties. The Corps lost 2 days of supplies, 2 days of delayed ammunition, 2 days of delayed winter clothing, 2 days of hungry horses and cold infantry. Those 2 days did not win a battle. They did not liberate Warsaw. But they created disequilibrium in schedules that fed an entire military formation. Delays compounded. Missed deliveries forced ration adjustments. Commanders made decisions with imperfect information. 1,000 small frictions slowed an army. And all because one man understood steel like firewood. The Germans noticed the wedge marks eventually. They photographed the contorted track, filed a report, and forwarded it to Berlin. The language of the report was dry, clinical, bureaucratic. Unidentified method of precise sabotage, likely using shaped charges. Investigation required. They did not know the charge was not shaped by factories. It was shaped by a pencil on bread paper. And somewhere in Warsaw, a quiet partisan sharpened another wedge. Mid-October, 1942. The Polish Home Army attempted to copy what they called the silent split. Word traveled through courier networks as if carried on wind. The sabotage at Gołąbki was no longer just a disruption. It was a method, a tool that could be applied wherever rail steel crossed occupation territory. In safe houses and barns, partisans now wrapped fertilizer mixtures in paper, scavenged iron wedges from carts and plows, and hunted for broken telegraph insulators along abandoned roads. They were soldiers trying to become engineers overnight, improvising from rumor rather than mathematics. They knew what happened. They did not know how. 2 attempts produced merely bent rails. Both required only 6 or 7 hours for repair. One attempt destroyed a detonator before ignition. One attempt veered the blast so far off alignment that the railhead remained untouched while gravel flew into trees. Then came the failure that cost lives. The town of Skierniewice, 25 kilometers west of Wołocz, had an active partisan cell. They obtained 2 wedges from a hay baler and a jar of nitrate scraped from fertilizer sacks stored behind a German commandeered grain mill. They did not understand nitrate ratios. They did not understand wedge angles. They used an ordinary blasting fuse, measured by guesswork. On the night of October 19th, they placed their crude device against a rail leading into a munitions depot. The fuse burned irregularly due to moisture. The device detonated prematurely while one man was still placing the brace stone. The blast tore through his leg and severed it below the knee. The others panicked. They left him, bleeding into the ballast, knowing German patrols would arrive before they could amputate or carry him away. A farmer found his body at dawn. The Germans found the farmer. They assumed he was involved. He died in interrogation. No rail was damaged, no train delayed. The failed imitation killed 2 men who never touched a rifle in combat. When a courier brought the report to Warsaw, Kwiatkowski read it in silence. His platoon commander said, "They tried your method. It nearly worked." "No," Kwiatkowski answered. "Nearly is failure." The commander spoke with quiet anger. "You cannot control how others fight." "I must control how others learn," Kwiatkowski replied. He spent the next 2 days writing instructions. Not poetic slogans, not morale-boosting pamphlets. Instructions. Exact ratios, angles, clamping requirements, fuse, tolerances. He drew diagrams showing the rail web, the grain structure, the direction of explosive pressure. He explained how humidity altered combustion speed and how soft ground allowed force to escape. He warned, never use quarry fuses near moisture, never brace with stone, never ignite without checking rail bolts first. He wrote in measured handwriting, line after line, as if drafting blueprints. Each sheet carried the same phrase in bold pencil at the top. Explosion is not destruction. Explosion is direction. 2 teenage messengers delivered the packets by bicycle to neighboring districts. They rode through drizzle and mud roads, resting in barns, avoiding checkpoints. The packets circulated among sabotage cells, like forbidden textbooks. Some partisans scoffed. They said war demanded action, not calculation. They said the Home Army could not wage war with pencils. One commander in Girardov crumpled the instructions and snapped, "We need fighters, not schoolmasters." Yet 1 week later, after 2 more derailments, that same commander requested more drawings. Kwiatkowski never argued. He never defended himself. When asked why wedges mattered, he said only, "Steel chooses how it wants to break. We only help it decide." Soon, the Home Army began to understand. Not quickly, not perfectly, but methodically. They paired fighters with carpenters, saboteurs with mechanics, lookouts with farm workers who understood tools. And slowly, the failures decreased. The next successful operation occurred near Wołocz in early November. A two-man team placed a single charge. The derailment blocked a line carrying animal fodder. Horses in 2 divisions received half rations for 4 days. The Germans blamed weather and poor scheduling. No reprisals followed. No one was shot. The sabotage was invisible. Another operation near Sochachev twisted a track used for transporting rifle ammunition. German repair crews required cranes again. Rations shifted, transport timetables changed, and artillery batteries waited for ammunition longer than they expected. By late November, German commanders began to suspect a systematic method. Their reports grew sharper. Sabotage now seeks not explosions, but precision. Recommend technical countermeasures. Berlin forwarded requests for experts, but experts were scarce. Engineers were already spread thin building fortifications in the east, manufacturing aircraft components, repairing bridges, and maintaining rails damaged by the Soviet advance. The Third Reich could not spare more technicians. They expected occupied Poland to manage itself with brute force. Brute force could not bend a wedge out of existence. German railway police increased patrols, but patrols could not see what was hidden inside loaves of bread, wrapped in butcher paper or clamped beneath rails no thicker than a man's thumb. They were hunting explosions. These were cuts. When winter began to creep across the countryside, freezing fields, and stiffening metal, Kwiatkowski sat in a basement furnace room beneath a tailor's shop, sharpening another wedge with a file. His commander approached him and said, "They are asking for you everywhere now. They want you to train them." Kwiatkowski continued filing and replied, "Then we must teach them slowly. Fast learning kills." His commander hesitated. "You sound more like a professor than a soldier." Kwiatkowski brushed iron filings from his knees and said quietly, "If war had more professors, perhaps it would end sooner." He returned to sharpening. He was preparing for winter. Winter made steel brittle. Winter made sabotage easier. Winter was coming, and every frozen rail would be waiting for the wedge. December 1942. The first hard frost came like a hammer. Temperatures dropped below freezing across the Vistula basin, stiffening soil and turning rail steel brittle as glass. Wind scraped powder snow across tracks in thin white veils. Farmers wrapped their horses in canvas sacks, and German sentries stamped their feet beside braziers that burned with coal stolen from freight cars they were supposed to guard. To engineers, winter was a nuisance. To saboteurs, winter was leverage. Steel contracts in cold. Bolts shrink by fractions of millimeters. Rail webs stiffen and lose elasticity. A metal that bends under summer sun will fracture when chilled. When Kwiatkowski knelt beside rails in the dark, he no longer had to fight steel's strength. He merely had to guide its weakness. He trained small sabotage teams inside barns and cellar workshops. He taught them not how to blow up rails, but how to read them. He made them run fingers along the underside and search for microcracks, rust seams, moisture pits, and misaligned bolts. He forced them to examine rails like physicians inspecting bone fractures. "Steel fails where it wishes," he would say. "We do not choose the fracture. We encourage it." Some men mocked this approach at first. They wanted gunfire, not geometry. But after watching rails shear beneath charges that made barely a sound, even skeptics grew quiet. Winter charges became delicate instruments. A few wedge shapes, 2 insulators, and a small fertilizer mixture could cripple a track without shattering it loudly. In the first week of December, a team near Grodzisk Mazowiecki placed a winter charge using Kwiatkowski's exact instructions. The explosion sounded like a branch snapping. A freight train loaded with rifle ammunition derailed the next morning. Repair teams arrived with tools, but the steel cracked further as they attempted to fix it. Cold turned repair into destruction. What could have taken hours in autumn consumed 36 hours in winter. German telegraphs began referring to seasonal complications. Winter had become the saboteurs' ally. Across the rail system west of Warsaw, 3 derailments occurred in 12 days. None caused casualties. None could be dismissed as weather alone. Engineers began suspecting a new tactic, yet they lacked the vocabulary to describe it. One report in badly typed German used the phrase, "controlled fracture of rail base by unknown directional explosive." Officers did not understand how explosions could be directional. To them, explosions were chaos. To Kwiatkowski, explosions were chisels. He trained teams to carry single wedges and insulators under layers of cloth. He had them practice bracing rails on frozen nights, learning how stiff ballast behaved in cold. He showed them how to anchor wedges deeper into icy soil so that the blast would not dissipate downward. He timed ignition with the rhythm of patrol boots crunching snow. He never raised his voice. He rarely explained theory unless asked. He taught by repetition, and repetition bred confidence. Near Christmas, his platoon commander watched him set a demonstration charge in freezing wind. Snowflakes landed on the tar and stuck like white dust. He positioned 2 wedges at a slightly altered angle, then explained, "Winter needs less force. Too much, and the fracture spreads unpredictably." "You make it sound like medicine," the commander said. "It is medicine," Kwiatkowski replied. "We are treating an illness in the steel." The commander frowned. "And the Germans? They are the fever. We break the rail, the fever slows." In late December, the Home Army launched 5 coordinated sabotage operations across rails feeding the Radom corridor. Each team used winter geometry. Each team executed the work quietly, and each target was not a large artery. They struck branch lines, feeder spurs, sidings where low-priority supplies traveled. Not glamorous targets, not decisive blows, but delays compounded. Horses in the 17th Corps received less fodder. Fuel shipments missed deadlines. Ammunition convoys waited longer on sidings. By New Year's Eve, German quartermasters logged discrepancies they could not explain. Supplies were not missing. They simply arrived too late. And lateness forced rationing. Rationing forced hesitation. Hesitation slowed operations. War does not collapse from a single strike. It frays from thousands of delayed ones. Some German officers believed partisan activity was increasing exponentially. Others assumed rail materials were defective. A few suspected sabotage but could not understand why explosions left no craters. They searched for large stockpiles of explosives. They interrogated farmers about quarry thefts. They never thought to search barns for broken plow wedges and telegraph insulators. One young German railway inspector in Warsaw began noticing wedge-shaped impressions in twisted track bases. He sent samples to Krakow. The reply came back. Not explosion, metal fatigue. The inspector insisted otherwise. His report was dismissed as inexperienced overanalysis. Steel does not confess easily. Meanwhile, Kwiatkowski continued sharpening wedges by candlelight. He mapped rail junctions by memory. He studied temperature forecasts as carefully as artillery officers studied battlefield maps. When asked why he focused on branch lines, he said, "Choke a river at its streams, and the main current slows." His work remained anonymous. Most partisans did not know his name. They only knew diagrams written in pencil on bread paper, passed from hand to hand in unremarkable envelopes. None were signed. Winter turned him into a ghost shaping steel. The cutting season had begun. January 9, 1943. Pre-dawn fog clung to the rail yard at Czechowek like wet linen. Frost crusted over couplings. Oil lamps guttered in wind that smelled of coal dust and locomotive smoke. The German 17th Infantry Corps had ordered an accelerated supply transfer overnight, reallocating wagons loaded with small arms ammunition, winter uniforms, and veterinary fodder for horse teams. Schedules were tightened by the minute. Trains idled in place with steam valves hissing like kettles. At 0520 hours, a locomotive engineer signaled for departure. The freight train, 8 wagons long, pulled forward along a line that led toward Warsaw's southern corridor. It passed through the junction at slow speed. Track frost cracked beneath wheels. For 9 minutes, nothing appeared wrong. At 0529 hours, the fracture revealed itself. The 7th wagon reached a bend where rails converged from 2 siding lines into a main track. The rail base, struck weeks earlier by a directional winter charge, had cracked along its grain. The fissure had widened slowly under repeated cold snaps, each freeze pulling the fracture deeper like a seam being torn by invisible hands. When the wagon's load shifted on a curve, the brittle steel finally split apart. There was no dramatic bang, no explosion. The rail simply snapped. The wagon lurched to the side, its axle biting into fractured steel. Momentum dragged 3 more wagons off the track. The locomotive braked hard, metal shrieking as sparks flared. Wooden sides cracked. Crates spilled open, tumbling cartridges across frozen ballast like grains of wheat. The derailment triggered no immediate panic. German rail workers had seen minor derailments before. Repair crews were summoned. A junior officer sent an encoded telegraph. Engine incident, limited damage. Track disturbance, request maintenance team. He assumed the track could be repaired within hours. He did not know the fracture extended beneath the ballast for nearly 2 meters. He did not know the cold had spread the split under winter pressure. He did not know that repairing this rail would require a crane, 4 replacement sections, and heating equipment that had been redirected to the Eastern Front. He did not know that the 17th Infantry Corps had only 1 major crane within 100 kilometers, and that it was already engaged recovering a derailed fuel train near Radom. The derailment at Czechowek was not dramatic. Its consequence was. At 0800 hours, German quartermasters realized the next supply convoy could not pass. A second rail line fed through the same junction, but winter repairs earlier in the week had forced its closure for manual welding. Until both lines were operational, the junction acted like a cork in a bottleneck. Supplies bound for divisions near Lublin backed up into sidings. Horses stood idle in freezing wind. Medical crates destined for frontline aid stations sat inside unheated wagons. Ammunition shipments missed timetable slots. A telegraph to higher command read, "Through movement impossible until repairs complete." The delay was estimated at 4 hours. It lasted 48. Repair crews arrived by noon. They attempted to lift damaged track sections using jacks. Cold made rail steel brittle. Each attempt widened cracks. A decision was made to replace the entire section. Replacement rails were requested from Warsaw. The request stalled behind paperwork delays and courier confusion. The crane requested from Radom was en route, but roads had iced over. It traveled slowly and halted twice for mechanical checks. By sunset, the junction remained impassable. Officers began calculating consequences. The Corps reported dwindling fodder rations for horses. Artillery resupply timetables fell apart. A battalion near Otwock reported dwindling small arms ammunition. Frontline commanders delayed reconnaissance patrols, fearing low ammunition stocks. German staff officers argued over priority shipments. One colonel demanded fuel, another demanded winter uniforms. A medical officer insisted wounded soldiers would suffer if bandages and sulfa powder failed to arrive. None received priority because nothing could move. Across the rail line, in a farmhouse loft warmed by a single stove, Kwiatkowski heard the news from a courier cyclist. The man spoke in plain language, without excitement, as if describing a cattle sale. Chachówek is blocked. They say a train jumped a rail. Corpse supplies are stuck. Kwiatkowski said nothing. He folded his map and returned to sharpening a wedge. No celebration, no triumph. Just work. A lieutenant from another cell asked him quietly, "Did your design do that?" He did not answer directly. He pressed his thumb against a sharpened edge of iron and said, "Cold helped." Winter had been his partner. January 10th. Fog turned to freezing rain. Repair efforts slowed further as ballast froze into jagged stone. The crane arrived at last, its wheels coated in mud and ice. Workers positioned it over the fractured section. The crane operator attempted to lift the track. Steel cracked again, splitting further from the repaired seam. The operator cursed into the wind. Replacement rails, delivered late from Warsaw, were shorter than required. Measurements had been misreported. The crane crew waited for correct rails. The weather worsened. 26 hours had passed. Quartermasters issued ration reductions to conserve resources. The 17th Corps reported partial immobilization. Commanders wrote increasingly urgent telegraphs. None solved the simple fact: one cracked rail had frozen an entire corps. By midday on January 11th, heating equipment arrived to warm the steel enough to accept bolts and welding. Repair proceeded slowly. Once rails were aligned, they needed to be tested by a locomotive. A small engine was summoned to cross the repaired section at walking speed. Steam valves hissed white clouds into the air. Workers watched every joint. The test succeeded on the third attempt. At 1850 hours, 48 hours after the derailment, the line reopened. Freight cars began moving again. Horses were fed. Artillery shells moved forward. Medical crates arrived at last. Supply officers updated their ledgers with relief. But 48 hours had passed, and war does not forgive lost time. The 17th Infantry Corps did not collapse, but its rhythm broke. Momentum evaporated. German units postponed operations. Fuel rationing lingered for 10 days. Ammunition shortages affected training drills. Patrols grew cautious. Commanders lost confidence in logistics. A single wedge, a single fracture, a single delay. War is not always decided by explosions. Sometimes it is decided by hours. Kwiatkowski went on teaching. He refined angles further. He analyzed frost patterns on rails. He told new recruits that explosives were not weapons. They were tools of time. His design was never attributed to him officially. No photograph existed of him in uniform. No medal bore his name. Yet the 17th Corps learned his work through starvation, delay, and winter. Steel breaks, armies wait. And waiting is defeat measured quietly.